Hi, folks. Thank you for coming to Extract the Facts, a panel that will teach you everything you need to know about getting information from the government. My name is Peter Seife. I'm the president of the Deadline Club, and I want to welcome you to this excellent panel that our events chair, Jessica Seigel, arranged. It is one of a series of events that we do. We had one recently about artificial intelligence. We had one a little bit earlier about how to navigate your career in journalism. So we do this all the time. And if you were a member of the Deadline Club, you could have fun like this as well. So I just wanted to tell you that we are a club that is a New York City chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. Let me catch my breath. And we've been around for 100 years. We advocate for journalists. We provide a community for journalists. We help aspiring journalists with scholarships. And we recognize excellence in journalism. And we'll be doing that next week when we have our annual awards dinner at the Harvard Club. You're all invited to that too, by the way, but it's a little pricey. And if you want to check us out, we are on the web. You can find us at the deadlineclub.org. Even if you don't become a member, if you go to the bottom of the screen, you sign up and get on our email list, and you'll know about all the stuff that's happening. So, I apologize for being out of breath, but this panel on the FOIA is one that we do every year about this time in the spring, and I know you'll find it very informative, and I'm going to sit down and catch my breath and let Jessica take it away. Thank you very much. Oh, one more thing I forgot to mention. As a member of the Deadline Club, you would get an hour of free legal advice on media issues with this man right here, Matthew Leish, attorney Matthew Leish. So, once again, deadlineclub.org. Check us out. Thanks.
I gotta say that was the best speech after running a marathon that I've ever seen.
I just have to say it's an hour total, not each.
Okay. Hi.
Not
Okay.
person.
What's the difference between propaganda and the truth? One of them. All right, it's the facts, and that's why we're here tonight. I'm Jessica Seigel. I'm an adjunct professor here at NYU, and I'm events chair of the Deadline Club. Before we pry into prying up great stories, some very important thanks. First, to Journalism Institute Director Stephen Solomon for sponsoring us, and a huge bow to events coordinator John Sirocco for helping pull it together. John, are you still here to get your, he did so much work early on. Thank you, John. And on video, we have Adrian Mihai and James Berry. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to ask a very important question. Who in this room has had a secret source reveal a huge government scandal to you, then mail you secret public records that you couldn't find, proving it for a career-making expose? I wish. Didn't think so. Okay, we're here tonight to learn to be our own deep throat in a very journalistic way. It's in the movies, the Watergate, Pentagon Papers. That's the stereotype that it all comes to you like that in secret, but in fact, it's very difficult. And that's what we're going to work on tonight, from both easy and challenging and complicated. Everyday journalism, it's actually a bit of a slog. Backlogs and denials are growing, according to last year's congressional hearings on the Freedom of Information Act requests. And you'll hear us refer to that, it's FOIA. Freedom of Information Act requests, that's at the federal level, federal agencies. At the state level, each state has its own name. In New York, it's called the Freedom of Information Law, FOIL. Has its own problems, and we have experts here tonight on both, and we'll hear from them. We're going to dig into how to make public records a regular part of your beat. Now, for me, and obviously everyone's here, you're interested in public records, but when I hear that word, I go like, oh, it sounds very boring, like reams of paper and long line, you know, things that are filled in. But in fact, it gets down to the very fabric of our society, from what government workers are paid to toxic waste that's on our lands, and even so very personally, the prescription drugs that we take and the kinds of adverse effects and efficacy. So it's extremely intimate what you can find and affects us all. So don't let these terms, FOIA, FOIL, all that technical stuff, and we will hear some tonight, be daunting to you. Okay, we are going to get going with a proper introductions of our very, very illustrious panelists. So I am going to start with, all the way from the New York Times DC Bureau, Mark Walker is an investigative reporter who was part of the Pulitzer Prize-winning team for COVID-19 coverage. After an investigative stint at South Dakota's Argus Leader local news, yay, he joined the Times in 2019 year as the DC FOIA coordinator, so he knows a lot about a lot of different agencies. He's also a former training director for investigative reporters and editors. If you haven't heard of that, it's IRE, make a note of it. And among many other things, he investigates tribal issues such as flooding near nuclear waste, bad. Most recently, he's uncovered Amtrak executives' six-figure bonuses amid pandemic struggles, and we'll hear all about it. And now we have, I hope I can say numbers whiz, I like to say that, Charles Seife is an NYU journalism professor, and listen up, NYU people, he is the future director of the Institute as well. So we caught him before his heavy duties begin, and he is known for covering physics and math for 2 decades. He is a PEN Award winner and the author of 7 books, including Sun in a Bottle, The Strange History of Fusion, and most recently, Hawking, The Selling of a Scientific Celebrity. He, before that, serious science cred as staffer for Science Magazine and the New Scientist, and has contributed to many, many illustrious Scientific American, ProPublica, Smithsonian, The Washington Post, New York Times, many more. Okay, so we got some serious heavy hitters. And now, Newsday, investigative legend, and I'm not using that hyperbolically.
That means old.
Listen to the rest of it. Sandra Peddie has won 75 journalism awards. These are not small awards, including the $35,000 Selden Ring Award for covering pension abuse that led to changes in New York law. She was a Pulitzer finalist for investigating police misconduct and worked on Newsday's Pulitzer-winning team on the police disability fraud series. She is a police maven, a very particularly difficult area to investigate. 2-time author, her most recent book is Sonny, the last of the old-time mafia bosses, John Sonny Franchese? Francis. I really preferred Franchese, but okay. And now we have our legal eagle, Matthew Leish. And this is someone who would be available to you if you join the Deadline Club for all those tough questions. Has represented media companies and journalists for over 25 years, from First Amendment to intellectual property cases. His practice includes defending against defamation, big topic in the news, don't you think? And copyright suits, litigating public records disputes, responding to subpoenas served on reporters, and vetting articles and books. Before joining the illustrious firm Miller, Korzenik, Summers, and Raymond, he was the sole in-house newsroom lawyer for Tribune Publishing Company's media in the Northeast, that is my alma mater, including the New York Daily News. So that is our very illustrious panel. We are so excited that you all are here with great thanks. Okay, we are going to start with encouragement, enthusiasm, and positivity, which you will see as the evening goes on. We're going to learn the difficult part of Freedom of Information requests. Okay, so we're going to start with a question of the investigation that you found most encouraging. It doesn't mean necessarily the one with the biggest impact, but the one that really gave you the extra oomph. Charles, I'm going to start with you. In your Scientific American story, how the FDA manipulates the media. Can you imagine that? You show how the FDA gives exclusives in exchange for journalists agreeing to restrictions on their reporting, called a close-hold embargo. I'd never heard of that, because I certainly never did it. What can I say? You used FOIA to do this story, and tell us about it and why it was so encouraging to you.
Yeah. So this is a story. I'm a weird reporter. I kind of my background is in mathematics, and I wound up doing science. I'm interested in scientific misconduct, but as a journalist, I'm also interested in media misconduct as well. And so I had, over the years, heard some rumors that the FDA was really good at keeping their reporters in line in ways that no one could really kind of put their finger on. And so I was never an FDA kind of acolyte. I didn't do a lot of stories with the help of the FDA. But I did know how the FDA works. And so I decided to FOIA some documents regarding how they got the media attention, how their press room worked. And so I picked a couple of stories that were fairly suspicious in how the media was portraying it. That in fact, the key element was a New York Times reporter had let slip in her piece that they were given documents ahead of time under embargo in a way that was a little bit ethically questionable. And the questionable element was, we give you these documents so long as you don't do any reporting before they become public. And so the story landed without any external reporting, which seemed to me rather unethical. So we'll talk about FOIA. FOIA, basically, there's a baseline assumption that government documents that are produced by the government are available to you. And there's a huge honking asterisk there, which we'll get into. But theoretically, I should be able to get, for example, emails from the press room to the reporters around this particular event. And I did. And I did this for several events and was able to cobble together through these emails, these primary emails between the reporters and the flacks at the FDA, the pressures that they were putting on the reporters. And it became this story that kind of shocked a number of people, including NPR, the New York Times, some of the Wall Street Journal reporters were playing this game of restricting their reporting in favor to get these advanced documents. And so no one who was a party to this agreement would ever kind of reveal it willingly. In fact, the New York Times slip-up was the first clue that anyone had that this was going on. Interviewing, none of the reporters would speak to me. No one within the FDA would speak to me. It was a brick wall, but for the fact that I had these emails, these documents, and I was able to go and say, well, didn't you say this? And there was very little denying it. So it really was the documents that I was able to extract unwillingly. I had to fight for years to get some of those documents fully redacted. That turned a nothing into something which was relatively large.
That's inspiring. How many years did that take?
The lawsuit stretched on 6 years. I was able to get the core of the documents enough to write the story fairly early on, so within a year. But the final redactions, I mean, the lawsuit, I think, settled, yeah, it was 2014 through 2020, something like that.
Longevity. Mark, thank you. Very inspiring. Mark, you've made your mark both in South Dakota and nationally in the federal realm. What story where you used FOIA or FOIL, any kind, has been most encouraging to you?
I think it would be one of the first ones that I worked on back in South Dakota, where I wrote about the mental health system and how it interacts with the criminal justice system. So I FOIA'd a lot of records from DOJ, Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, on how patients with mental illness were being treated as they progressed through the criminal justice system, and wrote a series of stories that completely revamped the way South Dakota treats anyone who enters the criminal justice system that has a hint of mental illness. So now, before where someone would sit in jail 6 months to a year without ever having a hearing while they tried to get them competent to stand trial, there actually is now a system in which when someone comes in and they're arrested on the suspicion of having a mental illness or the mental illness contributed to their arrest, it's a completely different system now. And so that's actually one of my first big FOIA investigations. It's sort of like, it was very encouraging to me to say, you know what, I could do this if it's going to work like this going forward. It didn't, obviously. There were some peaks and valleys when it comes to FOIA work, but that was probably my most encouraging one and what kind of led me down this path of doing FOIA work.
And were those FOIA, meaning DOJ, Department of Justice at the federal level, because these were federal crimes?
They were, South Dakota has the worst state public records laws in probably the country. I think the U.S. territories even have better public records laws than South Dakota. And so, and able to like do the story, I had to teach myself FOIA and how to navigate the federal FOIA system to actually get documents about South Dakota. So I went to DOJ to get records on the South Dakota's prison system. I went to get the Centers of Medicaid and Medicare on the federal level to get documents about the mental health hospitals and the treatments that were going on at the state mental health facilities. And so I taught myself those skills and used federal FOIA because our public record system was so broken.
Extremely interesting, and part of the workarounds that we're going to hear much more about tonight that sort of will emerge as a theme. Excuse me. Sandra, you've talked about your most encouraging story being one about a lack of attention to missing person reports in Suffolk County that led to a change in policing that deeply affects families. Could you tell us about this? What was the problem to begin with, and how you used record laws to uncover it?
Well, Long Island has the highest paid police in the country. Police officers last year made $400,000 a year. So I'm not exaggerating when I say that. And that means, because all the money goes to police salaries, they don't have the budget for other things like a missing persons unit. And so I put in a Freedom of Information request for all the missing persons in both counties, and they just ignored me, the two police departments, as they are wont to do. They ignore me. And by the way, Long Island is the site of the Long Island serial killer, where 10 people were found dead at Gilgo Beach. Missing people, guys. And that case is still not solved. So what I did was I placed a FOIL with the 37 village police departments. And, you know, cops are the biggest gossips in the world, and they all got their knickers in a twist. But they gave me the records. And, of course, they're all talking to each other. And so Suffolk County wound up changing. They're now sending out press releases on missing persons, which they never did before. And they don't have a missing persons unit, but they've actually assigned someone to handle this. And I haven't even written a story yet. So that's the influence of doing this. And I don't want to take up too much time, but at one point I want to talk about Joanna Bird. And the reason I want to say this is we try to change the world, really, as journalists, right? But sometimes a story will change you. And in the case of this woman who was a victim of an abusive boyfriend and the police abandoned her, I learned something about domestic violence that I didn't understand, because I've never been a victim of domestic violence, thank God. But through doing this story, it really opened my eyes, because I used to think, why would a woman stay with an abusive man? And through her story, I started to understand how you could be trapped in a situation like that. And so I'm very grateful. When you talk about encouraging, I believe I've become a little more compassionate and understanding because of that story.
That's pretty profound, that you as a journalist get changed. You don't simply change others, you also have yourself changed, something very important. Matt, is there a case that you would like to mention that you found most encouraging and inspiring in terms of your work for Freedom of Information records?
Yes, actually, I can mention two very quickly, both involving the NYPD. The first one was back in 2014, and this was a case where there was an article where a reporter named Sarah Riley for the Daily News, working with ProPublica, was doing an investigation of New York's nuisance abatement law, which is a law that basically allows the police to shut down businesses that are deemed nuisances. As a process for getting a court order, they could find, for instance, a corner bodega was selling alcohol to minors, get a court order shutting it down as a public nuisance. And this system was really being pretty badly abused. Businesses were being shut down without much justification. Judges were sort of rubber stamping these applications. So Sarah Riley did a really good series of articles on this, and part of it was getting information from the NYPD about what was happening. So she did a FOIA request under the New York Freedom of Information Law, asking for statistics, numbers, how many times had this been done, how many nuisance abatement shutdown orders were later upheld, how many were overruled. And it was, the FOIA aspect was a part of the story, not the whole story, but it was an important part. NYPD really resisted. They spent a lot of time saying, well, this is too complicated, we don't have this, we don't track the data that way. It took a lot of back and forth prodding to, no, you have to give us this. No, we asked for it in electronic form. No, we know you have a database like this. Ultimately, they produced enough information that Sarah could do the story. They didn't produce everything, and we decided not to sue because at that point she had enough. And she wound up doing a series of stories that won a Pulitzer Prize and wound up having the city council change the nuisance abatement laws. So that made a really big impact, and the FOIA part of it was important. And then just briefly, a more recent one, the Daily News did a story about gun permits in New York. And they, again, went to the NYPD asking for the names of all gun permit holders, the permits that were issued or renewed within a certain period of time. There's a carve-out in the New York law that says this is public information, but a gun permit applicant can ask to have their name not be made public. So a lot of people opt out, not everybody. So the Daily News asked for anybody who had not opted out, and the NYPD played a lot of games with it and basically wound up saying, no, we can't give you anything because our records keeping is so bad we can't really tell who's opted out or not unless we go through 40,000 applications by hand, and that's too burdensome. So that one we did sue over, and the judge in the end said, that's ridiculous, turn over the ones who didn't opt out, and actually ordered the NYPD to pay the Daily News' legal fees, which was a nice little victory.
A great day for legal fees. Okay, we got everyone on this round, right? Okay, next round. We've already heard a little bit about it, but the theme of steering around roadblocks, and we're going to go to Sandra on that Joanna Bird case. The way you've turned roadblocks into a work of art, going around them. And this was a young mother, Joanna Bird, who did predict that her violent ex-boyfriend would kill her because the police refused to take action. He did. It was horrible. We'll spare the details, and it turned out that he was a gang informant for the police. You want to know why did they protect him? Police denied you the records, but you got the info anyway. Can you tell us how you did it?
Well, I should point out, we sued twice for those records. We won, and they still refused to give us the records. And then there's a law called 50A, which protects police, basically personnel privacy in New York, that was repealed a couple of years ago. So this law is repealed, and I immediately went to my then editor, Arthur Brown, and said, Arthur, we got to do this. This is our issue. We put in a FOIL for all the disciplinary records of all these cops we knew were bad. And again, they were playing all sorts of games. They wouldn't give us the records on Joanna Bird and so forth. So what I did was I put in a Freedom of Information law with the district attorney for Brady material. Brady material is exculpatory material that prosecutors have to turn over to defense attorneys. And exculpatory material will include disciplinary records of police, because police often testify in criminal trials, so it's valid for the criminal defense attorney to know. So I foiled that. I didn't get it. My former editor at USA Today, Matt Doig, he was investigations editor at USA Today, he did the same thing, and he got it. He just happened, it's kind of a revolving door with Brady material. It's sort of, you get it on a particular day, you get what they're turning over, and if you do the FOIL 2 weeks later, you'll get a different set of material. So he called me up, he recognized what it was, and he said, "Do you want a partner?" I said, "Yeah." So we got the records. So the point being, as Jessica says, is you're often going to have to work around, put in requests with other agencies, and you'll at least rattle them a little bit and shake some things loose.
It's sort of astonishing that they're ordered to give over the records, but they don't. Is there any teeth behind what a court says? It's just like they do whatever they want, the police.
Well, understand, New York has the highest rate of public sector unionization in the country, and the police unions are very powerful. And when you're also making a lot of money, you become arrogant, and you put judges on the bench, and so there's a real cycle that's very hard to crack. But you know what? They get embarrassed by these stories. They act like they don't care. They do. So they're important to do.
Mark, workarounds. You mentioned one. Just when you confront roadblock story, getting around it.
Yeah, I think a roadblock story was our CDC story that was part of our one of our Pulitzer packages. Was I got an email from our executive editor at the time, Dean McKay, was like, we need every document on COVID. And it came and it came in the middle of the night, so I just rolled over and looked at my phone and saw this email and I was like, all right, it's gonna be a little tough.
It went right back to
And I need to go right back. I thought about it for a little bit, and then I woke up the next day and I'm like, all right, I can't FOIA the CDC. It's I'm going to, but I can't do that because everybody's going to do that. And then everybody's going to FOIA the CDC, and then CDC is going to have 2,000, we want all your emails related to COVID requests, and then we're never going to see them. I put mine in on February 2019, still haven't seen it. And it's just okay, what am I going to do to get the stories? So I said, and I saw Trump, he went on TV, and he said, this is all the state's fault. The states are a disaster, the state health departments are a disaster, they don't know what they're doing. And I'm like, okay, what if I FOIA'd all the health departments in all 50 states for their communications with the CDC to see how it's going to go? And I'm like, while federal FOIA is going to be bogged down, the states are going to be fair game. I had to deal with the roadblocks of people saying, well, it's a pandemic, we're trying to do working from home, and then had our attorneys say that's not a real excuse, we're working from home too, just like everybody else. So you've got to get this going. And so when it came time to try and do the CDC is this organization that has one job, one mission. In the event we ever had a pandemic, we're going to be okay because we got the CDC. And then it was the CDC's time to shine, and then they fail. And so we ended up being able to write a story showing why the CDC failed, because in a matter of about 2 months from FOIAing all of these departments, I collected about 25,000 pages of records from across the country, basically detailing all of the CDC's failures in the early months of the pandemic, from the fact that the CDC's got fax machines. And when we used to see these jumps in cases on TV, it was oh, we've got 50, now we've got 50,000. It's because you had to fax the data into the CDC in those early months. And so you'd read these emails between these local governments, these state governments saying, we don't have a fax machine. We got a guy who's going on to the antique shop to go see if he can grab one and get this going. And people's why don't you just let us email it to you? It's nah, that's too much. And we saw these completely just an inept, unprepared federal agency who had this sole responsibility, and they fell flat because they were just woefully just weren't prepared to deal with this one thing if it happened. And they were they had nothing to say when the story ran, because every single line in that story, there were multiple emails verifying everything that we had, and they were just they got us. And so we were able to pretty much give the first really solid investigative story on how the CDC failed us in the first months of the pandemic by thinking about the workaround of FOIAing the CDC straight isn't the only way to do it. I can ask whether it's the governor's office, the health departments, these school districts who were also communicating with the CDC, just trying to figure out what was going on. Like that provided very like interesting details on like from the top down, like what people were experiencing and what they were struggling with.
That is extremely interesting. We see a theme, which is the interface between state and federal agencies that you can two-time them, or what is it? Double M them, something. Okay, Charles.
Yeah,
Wait. I got it.
She's the
theme.
most prepared moderator you will ever see. She really works.
We actually have a progression here, and that is you've sued pro se, meaning representing yourself, as everybody knows, in, I just want to say it, Seife versus FDA et al. I don't know if I got the number on the one you want to talk about, but I'm going to just mention a number 20-4072. Tell us, I know you've sued the FDA many times. Can you tell us about a case that really was a workaround?
Yeah, well, in many ways, kind of the act of suing is a workaround. Because a FOIA officer gets a request, and it usually kind of goes on a queue, and it may take months to go along, and the act of suing kind of hits the mule on the head with a 2x4. And you can actually get records faster by suing because they put you on the front burner. So if you're going to get, if it's going to take 2 years to get something, and you know the story can't wait 2 years, the act of suing is itself a workaround. So my first pro se case was actually suing the NIH, and I was trying to get records of that indicate conflict of interest of people who were serving on their committees that were advising them. And by law, they were supposed to be made available. It was very clear that they were supposed to be made available. I tried to get them, and they sent them back to me with everything redacted. So they technically complied and gave me those records, but the fact is, when you have a sheet of black boxes, it really doesn't help much. So I wound up suing and saying this was improperly redacted, and I wound up winning and getting those conflicts of interest, in fact, proved that the people were operating under this conflicts that they didn't declare. I'll also mention that actually the state, local, federal element did come into play with this case because part of it had to do with grants coming from various grant-making agencies to the NIH, and NIH gave money to these state agencies. And so when I was trying to get these conflicts from the grants at the federal level and was getting roadblocked, I was able to go to the state level and use, this was actually FOIL in New York, I think California CPRA as well, and get little bits and pieces there that I didn't have to sue for. So I was able to kind of progress with this story, at least get enough that I knew that it was worth pursuing to allow me to progress without waiting 2 years for resolution.
You know, it's really enraging what we're hearing here, that stuff that's supposed to be public record, they're like, sure, you can have it, and then there's just one big black box. I just wonder, are they just jerks? What's going on?
Yes.
Okay. We got an answer to that. Okay,
My wife's actually a Fed, and she...
Okay, maybe not her.
No. She complains about her FOIA officers for exactly the opposite reason that we complain. So when a FOIA comes in, it's kind of circulated to all the people who might have records, and they're sent to the FOIA officer who determines what should be withheld and what shouldn't be. And so the FOIA officer has to walk a line to figure out what the law says and what will not piss off their agency too much. And there are good FOIA officers who will actually, if you call them up, they will actually help guide you to narrow something or to go after something. So they can actually be very, very valuable resources. But I would say that most of them are actually obscurantists. I mean, they're trying to block, and because it's easiest just to say no rather than to say yes and go through these pages and pages and pages and the law says you have to redact the parts, release the parts that aren't protected by one of the exemptions. So they have, it's a lot of work to get a FOIA request, especially a big one, ready. So it's much easier to give a blanket no or just to hope it goes away because they don't have the stomach to fight for 3 or 5 years.
And one of the challenges of daily journalism is that when you're putting in foils, you're moving on to the next story, and so it's hard to track them. And so I keep a spreadsheet. I've submitted 45 foils since the beginning of the year, and so I have a column with the slug, the date I did it, when it was acknowledged, so that I can keep track. Because it is a lot. It's a lot of extra work, because as a daily reporter, you're running around doing a lot, but it's really important. I didn't mean to throw you off track,
Yeah.
but
We have wonderful panelists who are giving it like it is. Okay, so stick-to-itiveness, and for folks here, if you're doing your first ones, assume you will have to go back and just be ready for it and do it.
And look, can I point out that it's actually not as hard as it sounds to sue. That doing it pro se, I did it myself. It took some time and a little bit of money, but it was a great experience. And
wow! Wow!
I learned more about FOIA than I could have in 1,000 years without having done it myself. And also, there are lawyers out there who will do it on spec, and we can talk about that later.
By the way, when I spoke to Charles in advance, he told me that there was a moment during the pleading before the judge that he corrected the federal prosecutor, which was certainly, he said, made his year, and I would agree with that, so on a point of law. Okay, Matt, when do you know you need to call a lawyer? When do we be like, okay, Matt, we can't do it anymore, we need you?
Well, apparently you never have to call a lawyer.
Charles is unusual.
Yes.
He had to study case law in order to make the pleading.
Yes. Well, people do sue pro se. It can be done, and if you sort of spend the time, it's certainly you can have a great deal of success. I would say, in terms of when to call a lawyer, and just to step back for a second, it's really a 3-step process. So the first step is you file your request, and every state's got its own procedure. And the feds have their own procedure. It's usually pretty similar. You just submit a letter saying, I request the following records. And it has to be records. It can't be information, so you're not asking questions. You can't say, tell me the names of everybody who did this, but you can say, give me documents showing the names of everybody who did this. So you make your request. That's usually something you can do without a lawyer. I mean, it helps to maybe have a lawyer craft it, but you certainly don't need one. Then the request goes out, and either something happens or nothing happens. Either they deny or grant it, or it sits there. And at that point, if it's denied, you can do an agency appeal is the next step. It's an administrative appeal within the agency. Again, you can do that by yourself. It probably helps to have a lawyer help craft it and put some legal arguments in there, but it's not essential. The other way that you can get a lawyer in at that stage is if the agency just sits on it, because every state has its own rules about deadlines and timing. New York's is terrible. New York basically has no enforceable deadlines unless they're dumb enough to not acknowledge your request within 5 business days. But nonetheless, every state and the federal FOIA law have deadlines. And if they blow the deadlines or if they take too long, you can say this request has been called a constructive denial. Basically, by failing to answer it, they've effectively denied it. And that gives you the right to bring the appeal. So let's say the appeal doesn't work, the next step is to sue. And at that point, I would recommend getting a lawyer unless you really know what you're doing. The problem with suing is that's when it starts costing money, because now you're paying hourly legal fees. There are provisions under pretty much every freedom of information law that I know of to get your fees back if you win, but it's not guaranteed. And so New York, for instance, used to have a fee shifting provision saying the judge basically could award fees if you win. It was permissive, and it didn't work very well. So the legislature thought, oh, we better fix that. And in 2017, they made it mandatory. They said the judge shall award fees to a prevailing plaintiff, but if the judge finds that there was not a reasonable basis for the denial. So it's still not mandatory. A judge can easily say, you win, but I'm not giving you fees because even though the agency was wrong, their position was reasonable. So you have to work for an organization that's willing to spend money on the possibility that if you don't get your fees back, basically. So I would say lawyer is nice any step of the way. It's not really critical until the last stage if you're going to go that way.
There are also resources while we're talking about lawsuits. There are resources of, I think Mark and Sandra, you're members of these organizations. Could you just, while we're on the topic, tell us where you might be able to go to get representation without having to pay for it?
The Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, based in Washington, D.C., is great on FOIA, on national issues. You can contact them, and they're very helpful. It's a mix of journalists and lawyers. There was a famous case 20 years ago involving Vanessa Leggett, who was a freelance journalist in Texas, who was thrown in jail after she refused to give up her sources. She was doing a book about a high-profile murder. A local sheriff wanted her sources and her notes. She refused. She was sitting in jail, feeling abandoned, had no idea. The Reporters Committee came in and represented her. So they represent independent journalists, and they do give you legal opinions.
What about IRE? Will they also, you're a trainer for investigative reporters?
Yeah, so we have worked with them, and they come to our conferences. So if you have any questions, if you come to one of our IRE conferences, you can sit down and talk to them about and get advice from them on your FOIA cases, on anything like that. They're happy to sit down and do that.
Okay, great. So take notes on that. We've heard about award-winning stories that take months, if not years. 6 years. Anyone had a case here that was longer than 6 years? Okay, because that's a long time. Being a professor on staff with a paycheck from NYU is very helpful. He said, smiling very heavily, okay, because then you don't need to cough it up right away. Could you tell us about what are some simpler ways so we can get people in our audience going to, to just start it out, to drum up stories, to find stories on your beat through these kinds of requests rather than the targeted? Why don't we just go down the line? We'll start at Mark. We're just some simpler ways to use this technique.
One thing I'd recommend is to read the FOIA log for all the federal agencies. So the FOIA log is basically like this spreadsheet of like everyone who submitted a FOIA request. I'd say probably about 8% of all of those requests are actually reporters. So like the other 90 plus, percent of it are corporations, lawyers, things like that. And so reading through that and reading through that document can actually give you ideas. One of the benefits of like reading through that is if a case is, the federal law is like, you see something and like it's closed out in the FOIA log, if you ask for it, you usually get it in like days to a week or so. And it's usually some really interesting stuff there. I think in the FOIA log once I found that the former FBI director, he FOIA'd himself to get his own records from the FBI, and he ran into the same problem I run into all the time. He got denied. I think he got a Glomar response on himself, which was crazy. And so I thought that was hilarious. But that was something you could see in the FOIA law that even the director of the FBI FOIAs himself. And you can see there's usually a description as to what someone had asked for. Why is this corporation filing a FOIA request with DOJ or the FBI or the NSA? Who are these people and what are they looking for? And I think that's really helpful a lot of times for figuring out what's going on.
That's fantastic. Where do you find the FOIA log?
A lot of the federal agencies, some of them post it on their websites. You could also FOIA the FOIA log, and it's actually I've had to do that during the Trump administration. They took all the FOIA logs off all the federal websites, and that was one of the first things they did. They was no FOIA. And so they took them all down, and so I had to FOIA the FOIA log. And they would come fairly quickly, reasonably, in a couple months. And so I had a generic, already written up, quarterly FOIA that I put into the federal agency saying, I want the FOIA log. And I just put it in and just kept cycling it through to see what people were asking for.
This is very interesting because one of the reasons for the huge backlog is because there are so many organizations and people who are doing FOIAs who are not journalists. And in fact, that number has escalated tremendously, and that is part of the explanation for the backlog. There's many other reasons. But have you ever been able to find documents that a corporation FOIA'd, and then you're I'd like to see that, and find a story? Is that the kind of thing you're talking about? In other words, it's sort of still sitting there, low-hanging fruit, because it hasn't actually been reported though the documents have been pulled.
Yeah, and in those sometimes I've like seen that, and I would say that's interesting that this like random company wants that. That's kind of related to what I'm working on, and so I'll put in a FOIA for that exact same thing, and I'll call the FOIA office, and I said, as soon as you give it to them, I would like it too. And I piggyback on some of these corporations and some of these companies, their FOIA requests they put in, so it gets released to me at the same time as they get it, and then like it goes in our story. And they're just like, where'd you get those? And I'm like, you run the FOIA log.
This is great tips, folks. Matt, easy way to find stories using Freedom of Information?
I'm not sure it's ever easy, but I would say just following local news stories is always a good starting point. I mean, if you read that people are reporting on a prisoner who was injured or killed in a New York State prison, you can start by foiling records on that person, all records relating to this use of force, and then go broader from there. Maybe that leads you to foil all records about all use of force incidents at that particular facility in a certain time period. And maybe that points you see 3 records of a corrections officer who was investigated 3 times, and then maybe you go, I want all records about this officer. How's this officer been investigated over the past however many years? And you can sort of concentric circles, starting small and going bigger.
And just to add something just really quick, every beat has generic FOIAs. Like every beat has something that like comes out annually or quarterly that like you should probably be FOIAing already as kind of on a rolling basis, whether it's like disciplinary records in the police department, test scores at your schools that you cover. Like there are certain documents that like are out there that should be on a rolling basis. You should already be collecting, like have a calendar, reminder in your calendar, let you know to put in this for the request or this public records request to like get this data.
Make it regular. Charles, what are some easy ways, simple ways, although it's not easy, yeah.
Well, I tend not to use FOIA for story idea generation, but I did early in my career, when I started a new beat, I would often, this is dual to the FOIA logs, you FOIA FOIAs, which are now records that you could FOIA and see what other reporters were FOIAing, how they did it, what they were sniffing at, and you can go back many years because they will keep these records. And so when I started the NASA beat, I FOIA'd the FOIAs on the International Space Station for the past 10 years and was very quickly able to kind of get up on the controversies. So it's a very good tool for kind of getting up to speed very quickly on a subject.
That's terrific. Also, if you come into a beat, you don't want to be quoting other journalists, and now you have the documents in your hand that they relied on. You've just got them there, and you can quote from them directly. Sandra, ways to find stories?
Well, I think that, and Mark is absolutely right, on every beat there are records that they're used to giving out. So payrolls are a very good place to look for stories. Consulting contracts are a very good place to look for stories. Disciplinary records are kind of hard to get, but schools are really open, much more open. My colleague has been doing stories on teacher disciplinary records that have just been gold for him, and I feel kind of bad because they're so nice about giving the records, But so you can do that. The other thing that I would like to point out is, for me, I hate dealing with obstructionist government agencies, which of course I do for a living, and I get really mad. So whenever I get into a fit of pique, I send off a FOIL request because it makes me feel better. And I do it just because I know it's going to tick them off. Today I foiled all the sex harassment complaints, in both counties, just because I know they're going to have a bad weekend as a result. My point is, take care of your own mental health when you do this.
This is the heart of a true journalist, right here, folks. Sexual harassment, anything to do with the Eugene Carroll case?
No, it actually has to do with a couple of people I know are being pushed out because they sexually harassed women, and I'm mad at them, so I want those complaints. But it is timely, and the fortunate thing about FOILs is usually there's news.
Okay, let's get some top advice before we throw it out to the audience. Well, I mean, we've gotten a lot of nuts and bolts, but the people are new to doing these requests. What is some advice on how to do it? Okay, let's start from Sandra and go back this time.
Well, I find that a lot of reporters are sort of daunted about writing the FOIL letter. There are sample letters, I think, on the Student Press Law Center, the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. A lot of agencies allow you to do it electronically, but make sure you save a copy of your initial FOIL request and write it down, keep the date, because that's when the clock starts ticking, and the clock is very important.
With different deadlines per different states and different laws. Charles, advice on actually making the request.
Yeah, I think the best advice I can give is to really try to understand the agency that you're FOIAing. Think of yourself as kind of like a phlebotomist who's trying to pull blood from an agency. And if you don't know where the blood vessels are, you're not going to have the best of luck. So the better you understand the nature of the agency, where the lines of communication go, where the required reports are, where these annual reports are coming out and when, what information is contained where. The moment you kind of really understand that flow of information, the better you are at sticking the needle and getting precisely what you want. So do your kind of Schoolhouse Rock level understanding of how the government functions and how each agency functions and each department within the agency.
Matt, advice for the technical issues of making these requests.
Yeah, I would second the fact that there are sample letters available, and they're well worth checking out just to get a sense of how these are drafted. I think the Reporters Committee site actually has a FOIA letter generator that you can sort of plug in your request, and it'll generate a nice little letter for you. So that's a nice tool. I think one of the key things is in drafting your request to be as specific as you can, because it's very easy for an agency to either deny a request or say we need 6 months to respond if it's too broad, and you don't want to give them that easy excuse. So if you want something specific, ask for the specific record. Don't ask for all records concerning. So if you want names, you would say a document sufficient to identify all people involved in X project. You wouldn't ask for all documents concerning people involved in this project, because then they're going to say that's going to take us 3 years. So be specific. Make sure you're asking for records, not asking for information. Agencies don't have to create records. This is only a law or set of laws that apply to existing records. So if you're asking them to collate information, make you a spreadsheet, give you documents that don't exist, they're going to say no. That's an easy no for them. So be precise, be as narrow as you can. If you're asking for emails, you might want to think about, can I limit it to people who are the senders or recipients? Instead of asking all emails concerning a topic, if you know that there are only 3 people involved, you might say all emails to or from these people concerning this topic, because then the agency doesn't get to come back and say, well, you're asking us to search 5,000 people's emails, it's going to take us a year. So help yourself by being as specific as possible. The other thing I'd say is just stay on top of them. Sometimes you send these things off into the ether and you don't hear back. It never hurts to just send a follow-up email. Email the FOIA officer and say, hey, I've been waiting for a month, what's going on? Maybe it will prod them into action.
I'll also mention the federal law requires an estimated completion date, which they will always ignore, but it is a violation of the act if they don't give you this date.
Yeah. Yes, I agree, and that also reminds me, constructive denial appeals are very helpful. If they really are taking too long, you can do an administrative appeal, say, this has been constructively denied, I've been waiting for 6 months. And usually what will happen is you don't win, but the administrative appeals officer will say, I'm denying your appeal, but I'm directing the appeals officer to answer your request within 3 weeks or something. So you get action that way.
Mark, concrete advice on making these requests.
My advice would be, I treat FOIA and public records like any other reporting exercise. I don't want to seem like I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't want to send my lawyer to court if we were going to sue something, and then they look silly on my behalf because they don't know what they're talking about. And so I treat FOIA like a reporting exercise. Like, what is this document called? Who has it? What's it called? How many pages is it? Where did it come from? What's the backstory behind it? If you were in a meeting, who was there, what are their names, when did it happen, what day. So when I'm actually setting out to do FOIAs, I report them out ahead of time. And so to the point that was just mentioned of being clear and concise, usually when I'm going after something and I'm suing on it, I have usually reported out thoroughly and know everything about the document or the meeting or the conversations or the other things that happened ahead of time. Like an example, we sued over a internal report that the Indian Health Service had on how they protected a pedophile doctor for 20 years and moved him around the country. And one of the things that I did was I called the sources who I had and I was like, what is this document? And I got every bit of information I can get from every source who knew about it. And by the time we get ready to file the request, I knew the name of it, I knew the contractor who wanted to bid to do it, I knew when they commissioned the report, when the report was done. So when I put in the FOIA request, they knew exactly what I was talking about. They knew exactly the report that I wanted. It wasn't something like ambiguous where it was like, well, we made a ton of different reports and things looking into this issue or this person. It's like, I want this specific one on what you guys did to cover up for them. And so I think treating it as a reporting exercise goes a long way in actually increasing your success rate of FOIA and actually makes your FOIA better. And I think at the end of the day, you actually, when you get something back, it's exactly what you're looking for and you can do that story.
Also, because agencies can dump records on you. Charles, wasn't that you where they were like, yeah, you can have this? And it was like 25,000 pages or something absurd from the FDA. And so how are you ever going to go through that?
Yeah. Well, that was actually a request for clinical data for a drug which was controversially brought to market and I had caught word that within the FDA there was a lot of controversy thinking that the drug didn't work and there were side effects.
This is a muscular dystrophy drug.
Yes, Teplersen. So it was a drug that came out, though there were questions about the integrity of the trials and whether it worked and all that. And this was actually unusual for me because I was working with a law clinic to bring these data forward. And they actually wanted more data than I initially wanted because they wanted to free up these clinical data. But yeah, what happened was we got thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of kind of numbers on spreadsheets. And to extract a story from it was an enormous amount of work. And had we not done the research ahead of time to know kind of where things were, we would have been swamped in paper and just not been able to find it.
This was paper, pieces of paper?
It was PDFs, yes. I mean, the tables turned into PDFs.
Unsearchable PDFs.
Absolutely, no. Yes, absolutely.
They do that on purpose, don't they?
But that's actually a good point. You can ask for documents in their native electronic format, and you should if you want to be able to search a spreadsheet or something like that.
Never accept PDFs, especially not a PDF spreadsheet, because I've gotten those, and that is a lot of hours of my life I wish I'd had back.
I mean, it's basically useless. They can save it to be searchable as well as not searchable.
That's absolutely right. Although it depends on the nature, but if it comes from an Excel sheet, well, these actually came from a proprietary database, and so we went through this whole rigmarole. This was during the lawsuit. But yeah, luckily the essence of the story lay elsewhere. It was qualitative rather than quantitative, and it was actually much of the story was the fact that they were redacting side effects as confidential commercial information, which became as much a story as if I were able to release those side effects. So that's, again, a workaround may sometimes be that they refuse to release these elements that you want. And it may even be better behind that black bar than it would be if you got it in the first place.
Listen, the tip, I never would have thought of that, to make sure that your documents are searchable, is sort of a top tip of the night.
Yeah.
Because if you get PDFs that you cannot search, it's like a garbage pile.
Yeah, you got to retype that bad boy out, and that's never fun.
So add that to your FOIAs. Okay, we are going to open it to the floor. for your questions. We have a mic that James, Peter, would you like to do the honors to hold the mic, or Cesar? These are our illustrious Deadline Club members, one of you. Let's get some questions. Here we go. This is Eva, right? We spoke earlier. If you want to tell us, I know that you're a journalist.
I am. Should I stand or can I sit?
Whatever
Okay.
makes you feel comfortable.
Yeah, I work in trade publications right now, and a lot of it is looking on state websites. And if I want, it's insurance right now, so a lot of CDI, or California Department of Insurance and things like that. And a lot of times they'll say, well, these publics are actually online right now. And I'll spend hours and hours searching on their website, their state website, for these documents, and eventually give up. And at one point, for one story, I contacted a person who used to work in the department, and him and I spent like 2 or 3 hours just going through this website, finding these documents that were readily available. So I didn't have to request anything, I just had to search. Do you guys recommend how to find documents that are hidden within a website or hidden within a government website that are technically available for you?
One very useful tool that people don't know is that with Google, you can actually restrict your search to a domain. So you can do site : and then fda.gov, and it will search only within that government website. In fact, you can also restrict on file type as well. And often official documents might be in PDF, so you might search for file type PDF or things like that. And that may help. But yeah, it can be very difficult, especially sometimes the web pages are designed to be hard to search with drop downs and with JavaScript elements to prevent you from scraping directly, and that is a huge pain.
Could you do a Freedom of Information request for something that they say is already free, and because you can't find it, can you say, show me where it is as a Freedom of Information request?
I don't know if I'd want to do it that way.
Would that be embarrassing?
No, like it happens to me sometimes, to where it's like but the downside is I'll wait 4 months, and then they email me and say, oh man, this has been online the whole time. And then I'm like, oh, all right, thanks. It's like the PIO could have told me that like 4 months ago. And so I usually I'll do some research before putting in the request, and I'll reach out to the PIO, and if someone says it's online, I will keep calling until you tell me where it is or send me the exact link, because I will call back if I can't find it and keep that going. And that can be real annoying.
And it's good to call Friday at 5 o'clock. It drives them nuts. I'm not kidding.
Oh, she's serious.
How about at 4?
You can do that too, but they won't, in truth, on Long Island, at least in eastern Long Island, they won't be there. So I call it home.
You call them at home, at
Oh,
their
yeah.
home.
Yeah, absolutely.
They have a special blocking device.
Hi, I have actually so many questions, but I'll just stick to one at a time for now. I was wondering if you guys had any luck with Freedom of Information requests for body camera footage for police, and how you would go about obtaining media that isn't necessarily a physical paper document.
Well, we did a story last year on body camera footage, and at the time, Long Island police weren't wearing body cameras. But Long Island being Long Island, they finally agreed to do it and got paid extra to wear body cameras, which is annoying. But what we did was we went through lawsuits. And lawsuits are a great, great resource. And there are a lot of federal lawsuits, civil rights lawsuits against police. And so that's where we found body camera footage. And obviously, plaintiffs' lawyers are very willing to help you. The other thing that I'm starting to do, because Newsday's launched this TV streaming service, is every storefront has a camera. And if you have a high-profile crime, you call them and ask them for it. We don't pay, but you ask them for the footage.
And then the other question I had is, if they do say your request is too broad, which is something that I encountered a long time ago, I ate some very bad meat at an Associated supermarket in Queens. It actually had gravel in it. It was disgusting. And I was working for a local Queens paper, and I was like, let me see what's going on in these Queens supermarkets. This seems disgusting. And so I tried to ask the USDA for all the records of nasty supermarket meat in the area, and they said the request was too broad. I don't, help me improve that request from like 10 years ago.
That's a good one. That's a good one. And that's bread and butter journalism right there.
I guess it would. There's a difference between being too broad and then like being like burdensome. Like they just don't want to do it because it's a lot of work. And so like I've had a lot of experience where they say, just yesterday I called a guy who was like, this is really broad, and I was like, nah, it's not. And like I picked up, I said, no, it's not. I was like, what's your phone number? And when are you free? And like he emailed me his number, and I called him, and I was like, it's absolutely not. And I was like, let me explain to you. I treat my FOIA officers like they're 5-year-old kids. Because like if you do not, then they will just like divert off into like everything. And so it's just like, I asked for this specific thing. Like, here's the time frame I'm looking for. It's very narrow because it's looking for A, B, and C. And I explained to them how I basically built a roadmap for them. So like, all they gotta do is go back and then like, get it. And so like, that is like, it seems weird, but that's conceptually how I treat my FOIA officers, because like, otherwise, like, if they can take it out, they will. Like, I had like a colleague of mine just recently, she's like, I put in the same FOIA request, and they have told me like 6 times, like they've got no records, but there's no way. And like the difference in the FOIA request was, she said, I want all emails with like these 3 people with like any of these keywords. And they were like 16 keywords. So all 6 times what the FOIA officer did was look for emails with those 3 people that had every single one of those 16 keywords in there. Which like, there were no emails with all 16 keywords. And so like, she had to fix it to where it's like any one of these keywords. And it's like, oh, we got some stuff, we'll get back to you. And so like, you have to hold their hand and like call them out sometimes on like saying those things, because otherwise they'll just try and like swat you away because of it.
I think time frame is important for FOIL requests. I think if I always put in a specific time frame to try to narrow it. And the other thing I would say about grocery stores is, don't they get inspected by the state?
I mean, I tried, I think the USDA, literally it was over 10 years ago now, so.
But I would think the state health department would inspect them, but I don't know. But I would want to get inspections.
Yeah, and I think this is where kind of the anatomizing the agencies really comes in, because you have to know who is in charge of what inspection. For example, for an FDA inspection, I know that they inspect these types of facilities, and they will rate it as an OAI for a really bad one, a VAI for a middle bad one, and that for each inspection they will produce what's called a Form 483 and an EIR. And so what I would do is I would kind of specifically say I would like all OAI rated inspections, the 483s from all OAI rated inspections for the past 10 years. So really kind of understanding this, who is inspecting what the papers that come out of those inspections are, and how to describe them, just pinpoint so that they can't say this is too broad, would really nail it.
Yeah, I completely second that. I was going to make the same point. It's do a little research, find out how the agency works, what they do, what kind of paperwork they do. Is there a standard thing? They inspect every facility once a year. Does that report have a name? If you can ask for a specific document or type of document, specific time frame, specific geographical region, that's better than all documents showing, bad meat in this area, because they're going to say it's too broad.
I think I did the year, I think I did the location, and then I just had to do my other work because I just, had too much other work to do.
You can also, if you don't know anything about what kind of documents they have, you can always do documents sufficient to identify. That way you're not asking for everything. You're just asking, give me enough to show me this information.
Okay, get that language? Documents sufficient to identify legal tips. That's good stuff. Look, maybe next time with a talk like this, you'll be able to pursue it. You could just call Mark up or Matt, and they'll help you out. And now they're going to kill me. Okay, questions?
Yeah. First of all, thank you all for your time today. I appreciate it. You mentioned annual or biannual documents, making it a habit of just doing freedom of information requests for that. If you're in a new beat, though, or you're covering, a beat in a new area, how do you go about identifying which documents to actually look for to start?
Well, it depends upon the beat, but if it's a government beat, there are going to be meetings, they're going to have websites with agency agendas, and you'll be able to look through that and see what kind of documents, because government is really based on paper. I mean, they run completely on documents, and so I don't know what kind of beats you're thinking about, but a lot of the beats we cover involve some form of government.
Yeah, something I used to do when I was looking for it, I would go to the place that was my beat, and I would find all the blank forms, and I would take a copy of all their blank forms. And I would ask them from if I'm coming here as a parent or I'm coming here as someone who's a lawyer, what do I have to fill out? And I would ask for blank forms of that so I can understand what they're actually collecting and in what form, what's the form called. I also get the records retention schedule, which is it's like getting a menu at a restaurant. It's the document that lets you know every single piece of data a entity collects and for how long they collect it. So whether they collect something for 5 years, 10 years, permanently. All state, local, and federal entities have one. The National Archives keeps the ones for the federal agencies, so you don't have to FOIA. If you're interested in national security stuff, you have to FOIA their records retention schedule. But down to your school district and things like that, they have those. And so looking at those to see what information they're collecting is helpful.
Okay, the word was record retention schedule.
That's how long they have to keep it before they're allowed to destroy it. And by the way, when you ask for records, there's going to be pushback. A lot of government officials or a lot of people on your beat say, well, why do you need this? So, be prepared for that.
Yeah. You don't have under any obligation to tell them why either.
Right.
Although nominally, the purpose of FOIA is to show what the government is up to. So if you are going into court, you should be able to make the case that you are, at least on some level, showing that this is the workings of the government.
There was something Mark just said that I wanted to follow up on, that you're under no obligation to tell them what the story is that you're working on. This is actually really important. Charles had mentioned to me that in his experience, when he's done his lawsuits and now the FDA or whomever has to cough it up, they will also give it to other reporters or just make a press release of it. So I think the advice to play your cards as close to the chest is a really good one.
Hello, everyone. I'm a faculty member with Long Island University. I study journalism, social media, big data, and artificial intelligence. So one of my questions is, you mentioned when you FOIA, it's better to FOIA public records. Would it be possible to FOIA databases? So instead of we get all the hard copies and convert it ourselves, can we just FOIA databases directly? And my second question is also related. I've been using a website called muckrock.com to tracking all the information about FOIA requests. If the information is correct, I notice the top agencies, they vary a lot in terms of the responding time and also the fee they charge. So for instance, FBI, which is always the agency that gets the most number of requests, they, the responding time is on average 200 days.
It's actually 6 years. I have several FOIA requests.
I'm still waiting for a lot.
Oh my God. And they charge you on average $2,000. And I look at Department of...
Did you say $2,000?
On average. And then
you can ask them to narrow the fee.
Yeah.
And then and then the other thing is I look at the Department of Homeland Security. They charge you $132 million if the information on the website is correct. For educational institutions and media organizations, can you always get like a fee waiver when you put information in the letter, or do you have to specify, like, what's the best procedure that you can get most, like a fee waiver, or like, I think it's really expensive.
Well, let's answer your question about databases first. Yes, you can FOIL them. That's very easy, and we do it all the time, right?
And I can just briefly say on fee waivers, you should always ask for a waiver. I forget what the standard is. Basically, if it's an important public purpose, you can ask them to waive the fee. So you should always say, I ask you to waive the fee because some reason. And if you're not going to waive the fee, please be aware I'm a journalist, because they charge journalists less than they charge if it's for commercial purposes. So that's, you should always say, if you're going to charge me a fee, please put me in the journalist box, not the commercial box.
Yeah, never go in the commercial box. Like, as a journalist, like, I've never been charged money for a federal FOIA. And so if you put in and you ask for a fee waiver as a journalist, you'll usually get it. I think, like, there's a few, the FBI will sometimes, like, send you and say you have to pay this, but then, like, ask you to respond. And if you respond that you're a journalist, they'll waive it. Same with HUD.
I haven't had that experience with the FBI. They
Really?
charge me. Yeah, yeah.
So-
You can negotiate on the fee, but they give you a limited number of documents. But yeah, I've never gotten free records from the FBI. This is quite revelatory.
We could talk about this. we could talk about this.
Please correct me if I'm wrong, though. The 2016 FOIA amendments said that if they blow a deadline, they can't charge fees. So I thought that was...
Well, I'm waiting for records that I requested in February of 2020, and I'm going to have to wait another 3 years. So that's interesting. And they say it in letters. You know, the FBI, I've got several requests pending.
Yeah.
Charles, what is this amendment that we need to know about in terms of if they blow the deadline, which they will, then they can't charge the fees? Could you tell us more about that?
So I defer to the lawyers on this one, but basically every 10 years or so, there is an attempt by Congress to strengthen FOIA as the judiciary kind of pulls it back down. And the 2016 amendments were the most recent ones. And one of the things they did is Exemption 5, which has to do with privilege, is limited to 25 years as opposed to they can do it indefinitely. And I thought that one of the provisions was that if they miss one of the statutory deadlines, they're no longer able to charge a fee.
Matt, does that ring a bell?
I'm embarrassed to say I did not know that.
Okay.
Sounds right, but I didn't know that.
It could be true.
But they get around the missing deadline thing by sending you a letter. I think that's how they get around it. If they tell you we need an extension,
Yeah.
they're not technically missing the deadline, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes I get a bunch of letters in the mail, my still interested letters, of like, I got one in the mail that left me 2 days to respond because they sent it by like snail mail, and by the time I got it, they sent it on like April 3rd, and I got it like last week, and they were like, you've got till May 10th, and I'm like, that's 2 days. And I emailed the guy and was like, I'm still interested, by the way, and I'm going to mail this back to you because I had to sign it. Not only did I have to say I'm interested, I had to sign that I'm interested and mail it back to them so they would know it.
Games, 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 at the federal level. More questions?
Yeah.
Speaking of games, I'm really interested in just like the human aspect of your stories, the fact that you're communicating with other people, and your stories have hinted at some grumpiness among some of these FOIA agents, and you've mentioned things like you don't have to tell them why you're looking into this, and you recommended that you treat them like they're 5. But I'm wondering if you have any more advice or stories to share about how you go about communicating with these people in ways that, you know, help you, serve you. I know that there's obviously a lot of legality in terms of what they owe you, but it sounds like there's a lot of pushback. And so do you have any advice on like the way you phrase things and the way you talk to them, and emailing versus calling, in terms of kind of building relationships with these people and getting what you want?
I call them all the time. I always call. I ask them for coffee. I try and go meet with them frequently. I actually spoke at the FOIA Officers Conference as a guest speaker.
Good move.
Ooh, I want to do that.
They were like, they had a lot of questions. They had a lot of things they want to say. Anyone can attend it. It's the Access. It's a Society of Access Professionals conference. They actually had it in D.C. and they wanted like a keynote panel, and they were like, Mark FOIA does this all the time. Why don't we bring him down here? And so I was like, sure, why not? Like, I could see all the people who like don't respond to me. And I like got up there, and I was like, why don't you guys like respond and participate? And they were like, because you guys always are mad at us. And it's like every time someone calls, it was like, how dare you not respond to me? Like, they always get yelled at. It's like sometimes we're trying, and then sometimes they're not. And I'm like, you guys, it's like a give and take relationship, to where I told them, like, we're always open to having a discussion and negotiate. And they're like, and I try to talk to them about like the willingness to like be on the phone. It's like, if you call them and sort of like call and build a better rapport, they're a little more open to like talking to you and working with you. And sometimes honestly bumping your request ahead of others. And so I think like the phone, treating them like any other source, like goes a long way, to where I've had like investigations that like I end up getting FOIA responses back in weeks instead of years, because I had like built source relationships with some of the FOIA officers. There's others who like you kind of have a combative relationship. The State Department is the worst FOIA shop like in the entire federal government. We literally, like, to get one lady to respond, me and our attorney, we alternated calling her every single day for a whole month until she got pissed off and was like, what do you want? And like and I ran to her at this conference. She was like, yeah, I remember you. But like, and I told her, like, honestly, I was like, because you're not responsive. You're like the FOIA public liaison, and you don't do no public liaisoning. And like, I go to these things and I talk to these folks, just like share them our perspective and like talk to them about like the struggles, and like we're all not angry, but like the way the system operates is like, you guys got to do a better job than what you're doing.
I praise them. You know, when you raise children or dogs, you praise them when they have good behavior. No, seriously, you know, in an email and that kind of stuff, because people are human. Also, if I have a really juicy story that I know is going to tick them off, because, you know, they all know how much other people make, and, you know, they all keep track of that, I might slip in a few details about that story, and they're like, oh, you know, and they'll move it a little faster. So Mark is right. It's about building a relationship with people. And some FOIA officers are going to be good and professional, and some are not. And
I'll also mention that FOIA is a burden upon the people who have to fulfill it. And they treat it as a burden, and it takes time away from federal workers who would do other things. And so you do have a little bit of a card in that you can relieve their burden somewhat by streamlining and working with them. And with a good FOIA officer, you can work together to get what you want and make it less burdensome upon everyone.
I used to offer to come in and just review the records, or come in. I used to bring in a copier. They really don't want you there. And so that tends to move things a little faster too. If you say, look, you know, I want to save you the trouble, I'll look at the records. You don't.
Just so they allow it that you come in with your own copier.
Yeah, although now you don't have to, because you can just do it on your phone. You know.
Good move.
It used to be inspect. You can come in to inspect or get copies at an extra cost.
Right.
And so no one goes and inspects anymore. But I guess the old timers could
Thank
go
you
in
for
and,
the old
and,
timer
like,
thing.
Like I was including myself. But yes, I could go in and inspect, and I think that the prospect would freak them out.
It does, which is good.
Humans in their space. Okay, we're going to have one final question, and then we're going to break, and you should feel free. We have to be out soon, but I want to give everyone a chance to mingle, talk to the speakers if you want. One final question. Okay.
I hope I phrased this right. If I'm pursuing data from a certain agency on like a specific thing, should I ask for that in one FOIA request and then a second FOIA request on a more broader approach? Or should I put all of that in one FOIA request?
That's a really good question. And if there is something that is one document and they can do it quickly, I will separate that from a more broad request, because often you'll get a fast response for something which is a simple request as opposed to something which is complex. And one complex thing will slow the whole FOIA request down. So if you can separate out simple stuff, I usually do it.
Okay, that might be my problem. Thank you.
That's great advice. We've heard exceptional tips, advice, tactics, and stories tonight. Can we please give our esteemed panelists
And thank you to our moderator who did massive preparation for this.
Thank you for coming. Join the Deadline Club. Now you're on our mailing list. We're thrilled to have you here and hope to see you at our next event. Thank you all for coming.